Hello and welcome to our latest video on the Arseblog news channel about Arsenal women. I was going to write this up as an article, but I'm conscious we haven't done a lot of videos recently, and I thought, why not make it a video? And really, I wanted to do the video on Arsenal women's squad building this summer. So by now, as most of you will know, Arsenal have already made 3 signings. Amanda Ilestedt, Swedish defender, Cloé Lacasse, Canadian attacker from Benfica, and of course Alessia Russo from Manchester United. And it's led to a lot of questions from people, not all Arsenal fans in fairness, about particularly an attack where Arsenal all of a sudden look pretty stacked, particularly when Beth Mead and Vivianne Miedema come back from their ACL injuries, which they should do relatively early next season. That will be, Beth Mead will do that before Vivianne Miedema, I think, but certainly should have Viv available during the winter, I think. And all of a sudden, people are looking at this and going, God, Russo, Blackstenius, Mead, Miedema, Ford, Lacasse, Gio, like, what are we going to do with all of these players? Katie McCabe can play wide as well. And I think it's worth pointing out to people, first of all, taking a bit of a step back to last summer and perhaps this time last year, a little bit later, perhaps at the beginning of the season when the transfer window closed. And Jonas Eidevall was very, very clear that he did not go into the season with the size of squad that he wanted. Now, I asked him about 2 or 3 days after the transfer window shut last summer, so summer 2022, I kind of asked the question, did you get everything you wanted in the window? I knew the answer was no, so I was kind of fishing for it. And he said, I think we were one short. We'd have liked another player. And I know that was an attacker that he was thinking of. And Arsenal had a few targets they didn't quite land. Of course, the January transfer window comes along, and by now Vivianne Miedema has been injured, Beth Mead's been injured as well. They reinforced the midfield well in January with Catherine Kuhl and Victoria Pelova, and of course they bought Sabrina D'Angelo, a goalkeeper, but they missed key attacking targets like Debia, like Cloé Lacasse, who has now arrived, like Alessia Russo, who has now arrived. Even Signe Brun was something they explored towards the end of the window. Of course, they ended up bringing Gio back from her loan at Everton, and they got Jodie Taylor on a 6 to 8 week, about an 8-week contract, and she wasn't attached to a club. So really, I hope that doesn't sound disrespectful to those players when I say that that's kind of how desperate Arsenal were, but I don't think they wanted to take Gio back from loan. And Jodie Taylor's had an amazing career in women's football, and I think she showed she really still has something to offer. She's certainly not short of fitness, but I don't think that's really how Arsenal wanted to end the season with their attacking options. So this is bolstering, and it's a conscious bolstering. And I just want to remind people, first of all, of what Jonas said after the last game of last season against Aston Villa. He said to us, it has to be a very big transfer window for us, especially given last summer and this winter transfer window. In mild words, it was not good enough for us. We didn't get our acquired targets in the way we wanted, so we have to get that right this summer. So last season, that is not what Jonas Eidevall wanted with his squad. He wanted it to be bigger. And I think a lot of us have forgotten, just because of the amount of injuries, which led to a lack of rotation, which then begets more injuries. It becomes a vicious cycle. But in Jonas's first season, he was very clear that he didn't really want his front 3 to play the full 90 minutes in a game, because he put so much physical demand on them that he really wants to swap out, at the very least, his 2 wide attackers after somewhere between 60 and 70 minutes. I think he'd like to do that with his centre forward as well. And with Russo and Blackstenius, he's got the optionality to do that. We forgot that, I think, last season, because there just weren't enough players to make those substitutions. And of course, this plays into the injury situation as well. So, look, Arsenal probably in the main were unlucky to get the injuries that they got, but they're not entirely without culpability. It's very difficult to draw, probably impossible to draw exactly where that line is, but it's somewhere. And I think when you look at someone like Beth Mead, who's played so much football, Arsenal didn't really have a right winger. They brought in Lena Hurtig, but she was injured for most of the season as well. And so she was playing every minute of every game, and then in the last minute of a game against Manchester United, she made what looked to me like a quite a tired jump over an opponent on the touchline, and her knee buckles. And I think that to me looked like a bit of a fatigue injury. I look at something like Caitlin Ford pulling her hamstring in April against Manchester City. I mean, I really don't think that would have happened if, for example, in a parallel universe where Arsenal get Cloé Lacasse in January and they can rotate Caitlin Ford a little bit or even substitute her, I bet you that hamstring injury doesn't happen. But it does happen. Caitlin then misses both games of the Champions League semi-final against Wolfsburg. And obviously that was a huge miss for Arsenal. So Arsenal missed a big player, but also Caitlin missed two massive games, one sold out at the Emirates. And so I wonder if, I don't know this, but I wonder if a challenge for Jonas this season, for example, is convincing some of these players, perhaps who've become accustomed to playing every minute of every game, that's not going to happen anymore because we've got Cloé Lacasse, we've got Russo, we've got Blackstenius, we can sub you out, we've got the Champions League, there's plenty of minutes for everyone to go around. But yes, you're going to be on the bench sometimes. And actually, that's a benefit to you as well, so that you don't end up watching the last month or two of the season on crutches or in a boot. I've put that quite bluntly, and I'm pretty sure Jonas Eidevall wouldn't put it like that, given the choice. But, the injuries that piled up, like for me, clearly that has to be at least a little bit linked with the amount of injuries that Arsenal got, particularly in those attacking areas where they just couldn't make those kind of rotations. And there was another, another key, I guess, quote from Jonas Eidevall at the end of last season. Arsenal went to Chelsea in May at a point where, to me, they just looked dead on their feet because they only had about 12 fit senior players. And Arsenal and Chelsea had both played away from home on the Wednesday night preceding that. Chelsea had gone to West Ham, Arsenal had gone to Everton, they'd both won. The Sunday game comes around and Chelsea makes 7 changes to their starting lineup to play Arsenal. Arsenal make 1, and it's because it's an enforced one because Leo Volti is injured. So they lose another key player. So that's not a rotation they wanted, and they can't rotate anyone else. And after the game, Jonas spoke about this. And again, I'm going to read you a direct quote that he gave us in that post-Chelsea press conference. When we're building for next season, we know player availability is an important KPI, key performance indicator if you're going to be successful. Then we know the amount of games is not going to be less, the competitiveness is not going to be less, so we need a squad, a deeper squad, in order to deal with those situations. You see that with Chelsea here. They've been able to use their squad in a very, very good way, and that's something we need to do next season. So he's warming up to the idea of rotation. And look, as much as it pains me to say this, Chelsea have won 4 consecutive league titles and their squad is massive. So Arsenal's squad has to be massive, not just in terms of preventing injury, but to keep the squad fresh. And again, when you compare the two teams, let's put things maybe a bit oversimply. Chelsea lost Pernilla Harder and Fran Kirby to injury last season. They won the double. Arsenal lost Vivian Miedema and Beth Mead, and their title challenge collapsed. Now, most kind of commentators and most Arsenal fans have kind of accepted the collapse of that title challenge, a little bit because Arsenal won the Conti Cup, a little bit the run to the Champions League semi-final. I think that made us feel better about those things, but none of us will or should accept if next February, March, we're looking at another title challenge that's collapsed because players are tired and injured. That can't happen again. So Arsenal need a bigger squad, both for the health of their own players, but also to be able to compete in all of these competitions. And I found it a bit strange from some people who I think both complain about Arsenal's culpability with injuries, but also who haven't made that connection between the fact that maybe Chelsea don't get as many of those injuries, and maybe there's some reasons for that, one being the size of the squad. But even putting that aside, Chelsea is who Arsenal are competing with to try to win the title. And Chelsea have a massive squad, so that is what Arsenal need. We're also only just learning about the impact of having 6 Champions League group games in the winter. We're just learning about that. And those games are hard because the Champions League is a tight competition and you play good teams. So last season, Arsenal had Juventus and Lyon. And, Juventus were the ones who didn't qualify. Those games for Arsenal were 1-1 and 1-0. They were tight, competitive games. So it's not like having 6 Conti Cup group games where you can play your reserves and beat a championship side 8-0. It's very different in terms of intensity. And Arsenal need the optionality to be able to cope with that. And I'm quite surprised there are quite a lot of people who haven't really made that connection. And I think both as fans and as players, we're all going to have to accept that level of rotation. We might have to accept that our favourite player is on the bench once in a while. And that's something I'm really looking forward to seeing, quite frankly. And also, don't forget, we've got the 5 sub rule now. And again, I think maybe Arsenal fans have forgotten about that because it feels like a long time since we've been able to make 5 substitutions. So, you've got Cloé Lacasse on the bench. If you've got Stina or Alessia Russo on the bench, bringing them on either to salvage a game, to protect a game, or because the game's won and you can just bring them on and give them a run out. I think that's something we've really forgotten. And I think back to the draw with Chelsea at Emirates in January, where Arsenal, I think, dominated 70 minutes of that game. And then what did Chelsea do? They brought on Kankovic, they brought on Canarid, they brought on all these players. They made all 5 of their subs that day, and Arsenal made 1. And I think that really made a difference. And you saw Chelsea turn the screw. You saw them play a slightly different way to how they played in the first half. Perisic was another player they brought on. They changed their formation to a back 3. And again, this is something Jonas Eidevall has shown a willingness to do. We've seen him go to the back 3 this season. He's indicated that he was minded to try that before all of the injuries came in. So the team's built greater tactical flexibility this season with the move to the back 3 at the end of last season. That's another tool in Jonas Eidevall's tool belt at the moment next season. That's another thing he's going to be able to do. He's going to be able to much more easily switch a formation, go to a back 3, again, either to protect a game or to go and attack it. And again, having this kind of level of depth of players will help him to do that. So yeah, I just wanted to make that video to make a really, really obvious point about depth being good, but also that this is something that Jonas Eidevall, I think, has always wanted. We perhaps didn't see it as much in his first season because the squad wasn't all his, and there were players sitting on the bench I don't think he really wanted or trusted. And in his second season, he couldn't rotate because of the injuries, and the injuries were probably in part, maybe a small part, but in part caused by a lack of ability to rotate. So I think next season, I want, and I think we need, and from all of the things that Jonas Eidevall has said, I think we're going to see an approach maybe a bit closer to Chelsea's, where we should, fingers crossed, be able to make 3-4 changes for every game, particularly in that very crowded winter period when you've got Champions League group games.